If I don't know you already, my name is Rita Yoe, and I'm the Summer Camp Director and Programs Coordinator at the Claggett Center, and I am coming to you from St. Andrew's Chapel, which I know is a place that's really special to a lot of us and where we weren't able to gather this summer during camp, but I'm really excited for this opportunity to be in this space and talking with you in the season of Advent, which is something we don't get to do every year. So every week in Advent, we read words from the prophet Isaiah. And the prophecies in Isaiah were written more than 2,500 years ago, over a very long period of time. And during some of those times, the prophet is speaking to the Hebrew people when they're afraid, during times when they're far away from their home, times when they feel exhausted by violence and injustice around them, and even times when they come back home and find that it wasn't quite like they expected. And in these prophecies, Isaiah tells the Hebrew people, and when we read them, we hear what God is like. Isaiah paints beautiful pictures for us to show us that God is with us even in the most troubled times, and that at the same time, God is bigger and more wonderful than we can imagine. I love reading from Isaiah in this season because Isaiah reminds me to make room for God to be better than I expected. When I see things in my life that are going wrong or things in the world around me that are not like God intended them to be, it can be really easy to picture God as someone who's going to take things back to normal, right? We've heard that a lot this year. Sometimes it feels like we see God as our personal assistant who's just going to fix up these little problems for us and we can be back on our way doing things just as we are used to doing them. Another way it can be really easy to picture God as like a superhero who's going to swoop in and save the day. It was really easy for the Hebrew people who were hearing these prophecies for the first time, and for us who are listening to them today, to picture God as a warrior who was going to take revenge on their enemies. And Isaiah reminds us that sometimes that's exactly how God shows up. God is strong and powerful, and God cares about anyone who's left out or hurt by the world and the systems that we live in. But Isaiah also tells us to stretch our imaginations and leave room for God to show up in all kinds of different ways. Isaiah 40, which we read in the second week of Advent, says, "God rules with might, and he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arm and gently lead the mother sheep." As we wait for God to be revealed in the world this Advent, maybe we can look for those who are gently taking care of people who are vulnerable. That's a kind of strength that God shows. Isaiah tells us, in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for God. Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain made low. The uneven ground will be made level, and the rough places a plain. As we wait for God to be revealed in the world this Advent, maybe we can look to places that seem dangerous or impossible to get through, knowing that God is at work there even now. In Isaiah 61, which we read in the third week of Advent, we hear that God has sent Isaiah to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. As we wait for God's coming into the world this Advent, maybe we can look for people who are sharing God's good news. Maybe we can look for people who are showing forgiveness and mercy when it would be easy to hold grudges. We hear, "God has sent me to comfort all who mourn, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities." As we wait for God's coming into the world this Advent, maybe we can look bravely at the sadness and pain and destruction in the world, knowing that God has promised to bring new life where we never thought it would be possible. A writer and artist that I love, Brian Andreas, wrote about a creature who's on fire with love, but it's still scary because most people think that love only looks like one thing instead of the whole world. Maybe God is showing up as rest in a world that feels like it's moving too fast. And maybe sometimes God is in a push to get moving. Maybe sometimes God is lowering a mountain you thought you could never climb or making a rough place plain. Maybe sometimes you'll hear God's word this season with a loud shout from a mountaintop. Or maybe sometimes you'll hear it through a gentle hand or a word of forgiveness. This Advent, let's look for God in the whole world. Maybe God is showing up when we say the words from Isaiah 40, which were written to a world where when people looked around, it seemed like everyone had lost sight of God. Maybe we can say, "O Lord, you are the potter, and we are the clay." Maybe God will make us into a sign of God's love this season if we make room for God to work. God's peace be with you this season, friends. Be safe, be well, and I hope that before too long we can be back together in this space again.